Hi, good afternoon or good morning if you're in North America, and welcome to this session, the future of nature finance. First of all, thank you very much for Rix for inviting us to speak on this panel. My name's Nigel Greenhill. I'm an innovation strategist at Insta Associates. We focus on building more sustainable businesses to tackle climate change and improve natural capital. I'm also a director at Hillstone and Wood, a nature finance venture incubated by Insta Associates and funded by the Environmental Agency. So today, nature finance couldn't be more important. As we've been aware over the last decade of the imperative to fix our climate, also we need to fix our nature. These two things are deeply symbiotic. If we do not look after nature, we will not solve the climate challenge. As we've seen from the UN, we've plenty of information out there that points to the fact that the investment that's going into to nature at the moment is nowhere near where it needs to be. In fact, it's a quarter of where it should be. We need to be moving from approximately 113 billion invested annually to 536 billion invested naturally. And that is where nature finance comes in. Today on this panel, we're going to be looking through, well, what is nature finance? What's the drivers of it? What are people doing now and how are they investing in nature? What are some of the challenges of this? And then looking towards the future of some of the things that you could be thinking about doing yourselves within your own organizations and things to look for on the international stage. So to help us with some of these difficult, complex, but also inspiring questions, we've got a wonderful panel today. The panel includes Shijing Liu from the World Economic Forum, Max Riva from the EBRD, and Jenny Merriman from WSP. Each one of the speakers will introduce themselves and then we'll dive into the questions. So over to Shijing.
Thank you for having me today. So just a quick introduction. My name is Xing and I lead the Champions for Nature community at the World Economic Forum. What we do is basically two work streams. The first one is on financing for nature, and second one is more focused on business actions. So the overall goal is really to convene a group of leaders from businesses, government, and also financial institutions to accelerate the transition towards nature positive and net zero. Thank you.
Perfect. Jenny?
Hello everyone, delighted to be here. Opportunity to talk to you about this topic today. I work for a global professional services consultancy called WSP. About a third of us currently are focused on environment and sustainability advice for our clients. I sit within the UK business and lead our natural capital and biodiversity work. So that's with both public sector and private sector clients, looking at measuring impacts and dependencies on nature, thinking about how they can identify risks and opportunities, and more recently, thinking about what nature positive might mean for them.
Wonderful. And Max?
Hello, nice to meet you all virtually. Welcome and a pleasure to be here. You can call me Max, and I've grown with the market in the past 10 years on nature finance, first with the development program of the UN on the Biodiversity Finance Initiative. Then I moved to manage a blended finance portfolio for the Joint SG Fund, and just recently joined the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So looking forward to discuss those interesting topics and to also answer any question that you might have. So thank you.
Perfect. Yeah. So over the next session, before we dive into the questions, the panel discussion will last approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. And if you do have some questions, please do put them into the chat, and we can rattle through them at the end and talk to those interests. So let's dive in. So for the first one is, what is nature-based finance and what are the drivers for it? And perhaps if we can start off with Shijing, that would be lovely.
Yeah, sure. I guess the question, what is financing for nature? What is financing for nature-based solutions? When I think about this question, I guess there are two ways to look at it. First one is, of course, we can categorize into public financing and private financing. So public financing would include, for example, international financial flows, ODAs, synergy with climate finance, but also like harmful subsidies and domestic resource mobilization. In terms of private finance, it could come from companies' investment, but also like financial institutions, banks, insurance, and also investors, right? So this is the first way I look at public and private. And of course, they need to be aligned. And the second way, I think a very useful framework is greening the finance and finance the green. So green the finance just means we need to make sure the financial flow from banks and investors, they are not doing harm to nature. So for example, the reduction of phasing out harmful subsidies or reducing like due diligence of all financing. This is greening the finance. But the other aspect is also increasing investment and financing to green opportunities, to nature positive opportunities. And this is increasing the positive flow. So for example, Nigel, you have mentioned there is a huge financing gap, $700 billion, in fact. And we all see from the COP15, the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework, it also mentioned 500 billion should be coming from phasing out the harmful subsidies for biodiversity. And then on top of that, mobilizing $200 billion of financing, new financing into biodiversity. So I guess you can also look at this financing from reduction of harmful subsidies and mobilizing new resources. Yeah, so maybe I'll stop here. And then I think the driver question is a good one, but maybe we'll see the other two panelists answer.
That's perfect. Jenny, do you want to take a bite at that particular cherry? I know you were just at COP15.
Yeah, so I was at COP15 in December for the full 2 weeks, and I think one of the main sort of takeaways from that was the strength and the presence really of the private sector, including financial institutions. There were side events dedicated across the 10 days to talking about the role of private finance particularly, and then also blended finance as well as being key to actually crowding in private finance and reducing some of the proposed risks that are perceived. In terms of the outcomes, I think, you know, as Qing sort of mentioned there, the key target around bringing an additional 200 billion of finance was really important. I think that sort of sets a clear agenda for financial institutions and other investors to know what they're aiming for by 2030. And then also that important component of reversing some of the finance that's currently going where it shouldn't be if you're looking at trying to drive nature positive outcomes. The other thing perhaps just to highlight here, and I'm sure it will come up again later, is the role of the Taskforce for nature-related financial disclosure. Although it wasn't specifically mentioned in the text of the outcomes of the CBD conference, there was a lot of talk about it being the most likely mechanism by which private institutions, corporates would report on their nature-related risks and opportunities. And TNFD themselves were sort of there and hosting lots of side events that were incredibly well attended. And from the delegations from governments, there was definitely a feeling that they were following it very closely, funding it in many cases, and looking towards this to really follow quite quickly, I would say, in the way the TCFD has become mandatory for large institutions in many countries. So I think there's a lot of drivers now coming from, you know, this global agreement that will filter through to national companies as well, looking at finance in the next sort of 5 to 10 years.
Okay, that's interesting. So that next 5 to 10 years, so that's the sort of, yeah, it'll be interesting to hear. Maybe we can dig into that a little bit more in the question, when we look at different companies, what questions they're asking now, and actually how people are investing at the moment. Because quite often we find there's the voluntary work and people who can see what's coming down the pipeline, and then there's people who are much more on the sort of compliance side. So it'd be good. Hopefully we can talk a little bit more about that later on. Max, what's your, from your perspective, we've had some pretty comprehensive kind of views. What would you like to add to the conversation at this point in terms of what it is and the drivers for it? What are the key things that perhaps we haven't spoken about so far?
Well, I think one thing came out quite clearly. There is no crisp single two phrases to define nature finance. And I think we need to be reasonably humble about that. We also need to be also aware that we know a lot about nature. So it's not that we don't know the topics, we don't know how it works, but we still don't have a legal definition. We are getting there. CBD, the COP has this broad reference to conservation, sustainable use, and restoration. But what is really happening is that most organizations, including the United Nations, EBRD, who work now, are basically listing all what constitute investments that can contribute to that effort. Perhaps to speak on the drivers that to me are at the core of what will become the definition, hopefully sooner than later. One is the pressure is growing, similar to climate. Things are not getting much better. So as we move along, the anthropogenic pressure will also determine what needs to be done as a measure, as an investment. Second, the framework that was mentioned as CBD does give us the map. So I would encourage everyone to have at least a quick read of it, because it tells the ambitions, and those ambitions should define ultimately what are and what is nature positive finance, and also to appreciate indeed, as colleagues also mentioned, the interest from the market. So hopefully in the next couple of years, TFND or other global institutions will be able to provide a crispier and fancier even definition of what is nature finance.
No, that's perfect. Well, look, thanks a lot for giving that. And I think I always find that when we talk about kind of global governance and global initiative, there tends to be this kind of spaghetti alphabet of institutions that are involved, the different frameworks, and it's sometimes personally I find it quite complex. Smarter people can put it into neat frameworks and work streams. But what I really like to do at this point is kind of say, well, okay, well, what are we doing at the moment? Where's some good tangible examples of institutions and perhaps some of your clients? What have they been doing so far, and why have they been doing it so far? And let's bring it into sort of some colourful cases of people doing good things at the moment. And in terms of starting with that, I think we'll go with Jenny.
Thanks, Nigel. So I think we're seeing a very strong interest right now from in the UK, sort of our local authorities, so our sort of delegated local governance organisations. So they are being tasked with very soon coordinating a sort of mandatory biodiversity net gain policy, which will be coming out in England in the next 9 months. And that will require developers to actually show that they are putting at least 10% more biodiversity back as a result of development than was there before. It's quite complex in terms of how it works, but essentially the local authorities will need to coordinate that system. And where there needs to be offsets, so off-site compensation for any sort of residual impacts, those need to be found locally wherever possible. So there's a sort of setting up of a new capacity within these sorts of clients to understand how they go about doing that. But at the same time, what's the opportunity for them to couple that with wider natural capital enhancements and also markets? So some of the work we've been doing with our local authority partners is really looking at the horizon in terms of where are there currently natural capital markets that exist. So we've got this biodiversity offsetting one coming through as a mandatory requirement. There's also voluntary biodiversity offsetting, carbon offsetting, some other sort of ecosystem service-based markets here. So we've been giving a lot of advice in terms of how could they access some of this finance, what sort of changes could they make to their land ownership in order to actually show that some of these benefits are additional and being delivered. and how do those mechanisms work. So I think local authorities is really key. We're also advising landowners. So we've worked with a beverage company in Scotland who were very interested to look at their land and how they could be using that in a better way, predominantly currently farmland. How could they be farming in a regenerative way, which puts carbon back into the soil, which delivers wider benefits for biodiversity, flood protection, and so on. So again, just looking at how can you change your practices as a landowner to actually deliver benefits, and where might you be looking to get investment in that or show a return to investors on the benefits that you're producing. And then finally, I think another big sector that's interested in this is water companies and utility companies. They fundamentally depend on water as a natural resource. They have an interest in nature-based solutions to reduce costs in some cases, but also because, again, as a steward of land, they have an opportunity to make a really big impact in terms of these goals, targets, and also make the most of any market investment and opportunities for funding that come through this opportunity with private money. So those are some sort of key sectors and clients that we're working with right now that seem to be leading in this space because of what's driving them really to get a better understanding.
That's great, thank you. I suppose kind of pushing it out to give some examples for the international audience that are probably listening in at the moment. Max, if you could give a couple of examples that you've got. I know not only at the EBRD, but also previously at the UN, that you've got some interesting cases of which are a little bit more diverse.
We have listed 150 solutions. So if you are curious, there is a catalog of 150 of possible solutions spanning almost from everywhere to taxation, to fees, payment for ecosystem services. So there is, I will not list them all, but I think it's good also to just a few numbers to recap before getting to the specific. So 700 billion is the gap. The current degree of funding is about between 130 and 140 billion, and 120 billion is public funding. And this is at 0.3% of GDP. These were estimated from some research that we have done, and about 1.7% of public budget. So still a little out of what is spent globally. The private side is also very small. So out of these 40 billion, about 20 billion is private, and nobody really knows what's in there. So nobody really trusts fully those figures, even if we are all trying to work out the perfect counting of it. So it's to compare, for example, this is like 14% in climate finance. Over 50% of the funding is from private sources. So there is something important around there. Some of the instruments I worked on more directly, and that I hope that will also expand a bit more those a bit niche market. One are bonds, actually green bonds, which were also issued by, as colleagues mentioned, by utilities, often semi-public institutions with specific measures for example, for the restoration of rivers, for the better management of catchment areas, and the better management of all the areas that might impact the work of utilities, in particular in green cities. Another area that I've worked upon is on impact funds. I was recently looking at a news from Bloomberg. They say there's about 1.6 billion across 14 funds, most of them actually starting last year. So it's extremely young industry that have impact considerations beyond that, but there are more and more entering into what is more mainstream financing, meaning the broader ESG. always keep in mind 1.6 billion versus what is a universe of 30 trillion. So we are really speaking of small numbers. Something that can be done. I worked in Fiji also to give a bit of since it's winter in several parts of where you may be. We work a lot with investing in the hotel and resort industry, particularly for the restoration of several coastal areas, as well for the management or co-management with private organizations of also protected areas, where there is a clear co-benefit between the investments in natural assets and the returns from, of course, property owners and the management of the hotels. So those are just some of those numbers. What I can tell is that it's likely not to be immediately happening at large scale, but what we see is a bit of a co-benefit rationale. For example, there was HSBC was assessing bonds and green bonds, and say 17% had something about biodiversity. So even if some of those instruments are not 100% about natural capital biodiversity, they are starting to introduce particular measures and particular considerations. So that's also why I would see in the shorter term some action and some happenings.
Perfect. No, thank you for that. And Shijing, what's the from your side of things? It'd be lovely to hear a couple of examples. I know that the WBEF has put together quite an interesting publication that's been looking at some of these.
Yeah, sure. As you mentioned, actually, maybe I will mention very specific one instrument that is actually mentioned in the Global Biodiversity Framework under the Target 15, using innovative mechanisms such as Biodiversity Credit. Under the Financing for Nature workstream at the forum, we are looking into this very cutting-edge topic on Biodiversity Credit. I understand this is still quite controversial and very new area, so I don't claim that we have all the answers, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be exploring it, right? So first thing I want to say is the Biodiversity Credit is one way to finance biodiversity outcomes that carbon markets sometimes cannot unlock, cannot finance. And it's very important that this is not for offset. The companies need to learn how to communicate accurately and effectively if they're investing in biodiversity credit. And I guess there are so many questions we are trying to answer. For example, how do we accurately measure it? What is the metrics we can use? If we're talking about not only biodiversity outcome, but also on nature, on water, on soil health. So it can be a dashboard of maybe metrics. Another question is, how do we verify the actual gain? And how do we think about additionality apart from carbon? These are all very good questions. We're trying to, have a consultation with key stakeholders. So maybe in the end of this webinar, I can also drop a link that the forum just 2 days ago published a consultation draft paper on high integrity and governance principles for biodiversity credit market. This is a draft consultation paper on what are the principles, what are the high integrity principles for this market. So this is one very interesting new mechanism. I also want to quickly mention some other initiatives in the Financing for Nature. I guess the other two panelists has mentioned, for example, a lot of other, mechanisms, but I think one way for companies and investors to contribute is to join a coalition of the willing to really signal to the market. So for example, Nature Action 100 is a group of institutional investors. They come together and this is launched at COP15 just in Montreal in December. And their goal is really to mobilize investors to drive actions on companies that they own. So this is Nature Action 100. There's also the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge, which today has already more than 120 signatories from financial institutions. And they all commit also to protect and restore biodiversity. So a lot of these coalitions of the willing, pledges, commitments that I think financial institutions and investors, they can join.
No, that's absolutely lovely. And I think, and one of the things that the patterns that is emerging here, this is an early stage market. And that means that as investors, as developers, as corporates, there's a different way of thinking about how to work in within it. It's not just a case of buying an off-the-shelf product. There's a much kind of a deeper sense of partnering with people who really understand nature, partnering with financial partners who are open to a conversation where risk is new and different, and that experiments are the rule of the game initially, rather than scaling of the solutions rapidly with a sense of no risk and, oh, this is a product that everybody has already. Now that's really interesting and very helpful. Thank you for those references. I think that also leads on nicely to this kind of the question around, you know, the wider challenges here. I've just tried to highlight some of them, but it'd be interesting to see from all of you what in a little bit more detail what are the challenges that you are dealing with at the moment with your clients, and also from a data perspective as well, and a technology perspective. Jenny, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the main challenges really is awareness and understanding of the clients, of what we're really talking about. For many, almost all, it's a completely new concept, thinking about, you know, valuing the natural environment and how that fits into sort of private market space. And we're all learning as well, you know, equally on the technical side as a biodiversity natural capital expert, I'm learning about finance and, you know, how those things blend together in this innovative space. I think, so firstly, it's about, you know, really making sure that who you're working with, you all have a common understanding of, you know, what you're trying to achieve and what you're actually referring to when you talk about natural capital and finance. Another challenge is around uncertainty. A lot of our clients feel quite nervous, I think, about the uncertainty associated with this finance. You know, I think, again, because it's a new concept, they're not sure how to talk to their board or their sponsors about the opportunity, given that they feel they don't really understand how it sits alongside sort of traditional ways of making money, if you like. So I think there's really that hurdle to get over. In terms of data, because we deal with data all the time and we do natural capital assessments, we don't feel that's a challenge actually ourselves. It's often hard to get data in the right format, and it takes time to analyze it and make sure that, you know, you're kind of putting the right sort of pieces of information together, and that it's all sort of verified and good quality data. But actually the tools are there, the metrics are there to measure a lot of different components of nature. Again, it just has to be understood as to what you're trying to achieve, and therefore what you want to measure and how you want to sort of output that in a report. So I don't think any of these challenges really are insurmountable.
Interesting. And Max, from your perspective?
Jenny, I totally agree. I think, you know, the first part is understanding, and to me, this is a bit of time to do your homework, and this includes everyone of us, including the institution I'm working now, really trying to understand what are the dependencies, what is the impact, what are the risks. What we looked at a few surveys. One was CDP, the other World Benchmarking Alliance. The other one is also, when you understand it, actually do some action. What has been reported is what has happened also for the climate agenda, that we do have alliances, we do have commitments, but then those are not translated into action. So that remains a big item, and there are also some misconceptions. Some of those actions are actually reputable investment that can reduce cost and do make sense for the business. That is not just about philanthropy or just about doing something good for the nature. It's doing something good for the business. But that element needs first to be understood, as I was said before, and then translate to action. There is a challenge, which is time. We don't have, again, that much time. So the challenge is how to speed the learning and how to speed the translation into action. So that's to me is a real question. That also matters for investors, because what happens there is a bit of lack of track records. A lot of the transactions are actually done in forms of blended finance, particularly outside Europe and the US, meaning where there is a de-risking element or a subsidy that is brought in by public actors. So it's very hard to scale it up in financial markets, and for companies, particularly of larger footprint, to be able to commit access and then implement those resources. So to me, the main challenge is how to speed this up, because we, as I said, we don't have that much time. We lost already more than 50% of our forest. We lost 70% of wetlands, and so on and so forth. So we need definitely to halt this and to actually restore much of the degraded land. What can help, however, are some of the mega trends that I have noticed. One is technology. We see it in everything. It also helps here with data, satellite images, can help to reduce some of the costs for both companies and investors, or even third-party verifiers that want to legitimately check that it's not greenwashing. As well as a bit of change of behavior, and you can see that in universities, you can see that in also events like this one, that there is a bit of a shift of mindset. So particularly at the highest level, many CEOs and many CFOs do understand this. And the third other element I would mention in kind to overcome this is that we do finally expect some legislation to be there, and I think that will help to level the playing field, make it easier for auditors, for all actors in the market to move upon and transact.
And I think there's a really good thing to kind of mention at this point, is that perhaps when we think about a new kind of financial instrument or a new financial innovation, whether it could be fintech, it could be blockchain, it could be AI or whatnot, there's a sort of sense of, oh, wow, we've got a new technology, or we've got a new market to take advantage of. I think the difference here is this: nature underpins everything. If we don't invest, the whole thing falls apart. Society, economies, the whole thing falls apart. So if we don't get on with it now, we've truly burnt the place down. And I think I don't want to sound shrill, but I think it's always important to ground these conversations in that fact, rather than to just treat this as a new financial instrument and a new fashionable market that people should be getting into. It is not that. It is at last the recognizing the externalities that we all depend upon, and that we have to take care of them. What's good for, what's good upstream should be good for downstream. Okay, perfect. Well, I'll pass it over now. Jingjing, what do you see as the sort of the barriers at your end? I know we've been quite comprehensive so far, but it'd be nice to hear if there's any ones that you could add on as well.
Yeah, sure. I think maybe two more things on my mind. One is I often hear from actually companies. One of the biggest challenges, they are already overburdened or overwhelmed by all the commitments and requirements on the climate side. So one thing that could really help is how can we integrate the climate and nature agenda and make sure to the companies it is not a new set of requirement or reporting. I know a lot of companies are now preparing their transition plan, right? Their governments and their KPIs, their engagement strategies of suppliers, for example, in the transition to net zero. So the question is, how can we help these companies almost adapt their transition plan to be also nature positive? So in this one transition, they can achieve both goals. This is the first one. And the second is, I think there is also often hear from companies is the proliferation of initiatives, like as you mentioned, Nigel, the alphabetic soup. This could be a perceived challenge, I guess, because from outside, if you look at the landscape, it is very, very complex. We have TNFD, which is mentioned by the panelists, but also just in the disclosure, world, we have mandatory ones currently developed by the EU, the EU FRAG. but also we have ISSB, we have SASB, etc. And also there is the Natural Capital Protocol. There is the, for example, SBTN. So how does it all link together? I think one very easy to remember framework for business actions is actually aligned also by 8 different initiatives by SBTN, by TNFD, is this ACTD, High Level Business Action Framework. Just very easy. It's A, assess your impact and dependencies first, and then C, commit, make time-bound and science-based commitments. T is transform. So that means transform your business model to reduce, to avoid, to regenerate, restore. And D is to disclose around this, all the actions. So all the companies just need to remember to do A, assess, commit, transform, and disclose. And actually all these other frameworks, guidance, they are currently working together, and there is convergence, alignment in this field, and they all have sort of a docking or a focus point. Some are more focused on assessment. SBTN is more focused maybe on commitment, and TNFD is more focused on disclosure. So this is a useful way, I guess, to think about all these different guidance. And just very quickly on the last point, I think we mentioned data, and I couldn't agree more with Jenny. There is a lot of data out there, although there are some challenges about data quality and interoperability. But a big question is companies need to understand what is the use case. What do you want to measure? What is the goal for this data? Because data can be at corporate level, can be on site level, or supply chain level. So there's a lot of data, but you need to understand what is the business case. So actually in the Natural Capital Protocol, the first step is to scope and to understand what do you want to measure.
I think that's really interesting. And I think, please do add in the chat at the end. I think you've got a link towards the ACTD, and then the a mapping out of the different, some of the different frameworks and initiatives out there. So do please share that. I also think within organizations, there's a sort of there's a cultural challenge that we need to be recognizing. Quite often people ask for data, and the reason they ask for data is because they're unfamiliar with something, which plays back to this whole point of educating. And one of the things I think it's really important to be aware of is to also question the data you currently use to make decisions. Quite often when we look at engineering solutions for things like flooding, they're based on imperfect science as well. The case for that working isn't necessarily correct, and the flooding still happens. So, but then when presented with the opportunity to look for something like a natural flood management solution, there's, oh, well, where's the data for it? Where's the proof? Well, actually, there's plenty of data and there's plenty of proof out there. It's just that people aren't familiar with that, and they're not familiar with the sources. So I think there has to be a sort of a little bit of people being a bit humble about new information. Also at the same time, recognizing that perhaps the systems and processes that previously that they've adopted could be on shaky ground as well. And to take a kind of a learning mindset, like you would do innovating in any particular area, where you connect with other people with different ideas, you pilot, you partner, and then reflect on it. And then that way, what we can see is that organizations that perhaps have been a bit skeptical can actually move forward and build up their confidence that investing in nature actually can provide some can provide some results that are not only important for them as a business in terms of reducing costs, in terms of, oh, now we don't have to pay for this particular problem, but also at the same time recognizing that how much nature supports their business in the first place, whether that's providing healthy soil, clean water, stable climate, etc. Okay, so moving on here to this kind of this next the sort of this final question. Turning to the future, what else would you do proactively now? We've touched on a couple of these issues at the moment, But if when you're sat in front of investors and clients, what else are you telling them apart from the little bits and pieces that we've already said?
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So I think, I mean, I'm just thinking about the topic of this whole week of these webinars, which is sort of sustainable placemaking, and in that context, I think really trying to encourage people who are doing placemaking, so projects on the ground, looking at sort of engineering solutions, nature-based solutions, is to think right early on about what can be done for nature and the benefits that nature brings to people. And I think that's been a barrier for some time because, of this perception that there isn't evidence, that we don't quite know how to make an investment case for doing something that's nature-based. And I think that's changing because of the finance that's coming in now, because of the recognition that there are ways to make financial flows work from nature going back into investment, because there are reputational opportunities and cost savings to be had, as well as transition risks. So I think it's essentially always think about nature first in any kind of project design or development that you're doing in an urban or non-urban context. Find the metrics and tools to measure how that could be enhanced, and then off the back of that you can look at how could that be financed in sort of innovative and collaborative ways. At the business scale, I think one of the things we're trying to do with our clients is upskill and get them to understand what they need to know, and that there's stuff they need to know that they don't know, and that the first thing they can really do is to look at their operations, then their value chain, and really think about how do they impact on nature across those different scales, and what do they depend on, because ultimately there's a huge gap in corporates' understanding of the risk that they're exposed to. We know that there is going to be a tipping point with biodiversity loss, and when that happens, it could be catastrophic for quite a lot of our economy. So right now, there's a risk because we're not assessing the risk. And I think any business needs to kind of put that really top of their agenda. And then financing, finally, is just, as Max mentioned, looking at ESG standards. How can they be much better looking at biodiversity in a more detailed way? How can they make sure that the finance that that they're putting into projects around the world in any country is really delivering good outcomes for nature, and supporting those countries that perhaps have less legislation themselves to meet these sort of minimum standards and provide the resource to help them do that.
Perfect. No, thank you very much for that. Shijing?
Yeah, I think maybe also two things. One is the forum, actually, our team is now developing a guidance on sector transition towards nature positive. For net zero, we have seen a lot of guidance on sectoral transition for each industry. So I guess for the nature, we are also doing the same thing. This sector transition will really focus on a heavy lifting on the analysis of the impact and dependencies of this particular sector on nature. So as a sector average, so companies, even before they collect their own data and do their own assessment, they can already know on the average, on general, this sector, where is the biggest impact? Is it on land, freshwater, ocean? Where is it in operation, direct operation, or upstream or downstream, etc. And also developing priority actions for each sector. So for example, how can you credibly, or what is the low-hanging fruit? What should you do now in order to contribute to nature positive in this sector? This is also in collaboration with other organizations like WBCSD, Visits for Nature, TNFD, etc. So I think sector guidance is a way forward in the next, say, 12 to 18 months. And within that, I think a key message we would like to convey is a lot of focus today is focused on mitigating risks. So, of course, companies face physical risk, reputational risk, etc. But it is also about opportunities. It's about seizing the nature positive opportunities on the positive side. We all know consumer preferences is shifting, and this is creating new markets. This is creating new product lines, and also in the process of, say, revamping the manufacturing lines or transforming the business model, there is business opportunities. Actually, according to an analysis estimation from the forum last year, there is $10.1 trillion annual business value to be created if companies is to transit to nature positive. So I guess in these sector transitions, we also encourage, we will also build investor cases and build case studies on what are the opportunities and how can companies seize these opportunities.
Perfect. No, thank you for that. Max, perhaps 60 seconds from you, and then and I think we're coming to the end of our time. And hopefully, I know we've had a couple of questions that have come in. I've noticed that actually our my colleagues here, I think, inadvertently answer both of these questions as part of the conversation. But please connect with us through LinkedIn or whatnot if you didn't find that it covered it to the level that you wished. But hopefully, I think we covered off the key things. So Max, 45 to 60 seconds, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, the plea is don't stop working or thinking just because everything is not defined or fixed. So that's really the time for you to start to think about it if you have not done it. It will come in maybe 2 years as legislation, as enforced, but please don't wait. The world cannot wait. What I would say is, and I hope just on the future, is like the easier things to do and monitor will happen faster. For example, deforestation. That's possible, that has been already there. So some aspects of the nature agenda, I would really hope will really move much faster to make sure that there is no deforestation or is reduced to the minimum, if not reversed. But so that's what I wanted to say. So it's a plea, and do expect and try to act where it's possible. And some of those, as everyone has said, information it is there. There are some cases there. Don't wait for comprehensive strategies to stop and destroy forests, for example. But that's just a very simple item. And as you will see, try to keep yourself informed. And if you are a company, you are able to present yourself as a leader in this field, I'm sure that you will receive a prize as the market will get on.
Brilliant. Well, look, we're wrapping up now. But thank you so much for your time, and I think it's been really comprehensive on providing the, what is nature finance, what are the drivers behind it, some practical examples, and thank you for all of your kind of detailed kind of comments here and appeal for people to act now. I think the one final thing I would kind of like to mention is that we're very focused on the kind of financial side of things quite often, and I think what we can always start with local community, and we can always start with over general social pressures. The next generations below care deeply about this, and it doesn't take much time on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, whichever one you choose, to see that people do care about this. And as organizations, it's our if in doubt, look at a local level. Your organization is rooted in whatever way you wish to define in your local community. If you can start with a very simple scorecard of, how are we impacting on nature? How does this impact on our culture, on our broader society, and our economy? You won't go too far wrong. With an inclusive group of people, you'll be able to see quite quickly some very simple but powerful ways that you can make change. So don't hold back and reach out and start now. But look, thank you so much for your time, everybody. I hope you found it informative, and feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn if you've got any further questions. Thank you for Rix for hosting us. Have a lovely day.